Want to know something that's so exciting to me? That Rhode Island, a state that Texas is almost 174 times the size of, has enough weird, cryptidy, and haunted tales to make an entire series about. I'm not even kidding. My list of leads for Rhode Island was longer than I even had time to cover in a weekly format. Today, because of that, we're going to cover some of the strangest tales that Rhode Island has to offer, the weird ones. Now, before we get started, I just wanted to say thanks for stopping by and let you know, this is crazy to say, but I just hit 100,000 subs here. And if you want that growth to continue, all you've got to do is subscribe, like the video, and comment. It'll never cost you a dime, and it's a quick way to say, hey YouTube, this guy's alright. With that being said, thank you so much for everything, folks, and come with me today, and let's explore some of Rhode Island's weird lore. Before we get into the very real and very strange events of 1892, let's set the scene with some superstition. In the 1800s, as Eastern European immigrants arrived in America, they brought more than just pierogies and strong opinions about soup temperatures. They also brought their folklore, and that folklore included vampires. But this wasn't the sexy-caped Dracula kind of vampire that we're used to. They didn't twinkle in the sunlight or have love triangles with sexy tan werewolves. No, these vampires were a far grimmer version, where people believed the dead could rise from their graves and slowly drain the life from their living loved ones. Combine this belief with the fact that tuberculosis, then known as consumption, was absolutely tearing through towns, infecting an estimated 70% of North Americans and Europeans, and you've got a recipe for folkloric panic. So, what did the good people of New England do when folks started coughing up blood and wasting away? Well, they leaned on their roots, and they decided that someone dead must be responsible. Only the most logical conclusion. In response, these communities performed what we'll call preventative corpse maintenance. This usually meant digging up the deceased and inspecting them for signs of vampirism. These signs, of course, included things like long fingernails, which, spoiler, keep growing after you pass away, or blood in their heart or lungs, which is also normal, and yet another reason you shouldn't go ahead and autopsy grandma with zero medical training. In short, if you looked a little bit too fresh for someone who was supposed to be dead, you might be accused of hanging around. This happened a lot too, well, relatively at least. There are over 70 recorded cases of suspected vampires being dug up in New England, and there are probably more in actuality, because these cases were basically only recorded where crowded city centers meant folks would actually see these exhumations. Regardless, few of these panics became as infamous as the one that unfolded in Exeter, Rhode Island, in the dead of winter of 1892, the macabre case of Mercy Brown. This story starts with George and Mary Brown, who lived in Exeter, Rhode Island, and had 7 children: Mary Olive, Edwin, Annie Laura, Mercy Lena, Hattie Mabel, Ginny Adeline, and Myra Frances. My golly, that's a lot of double names. In 1883, Mary, the mother, died of what was called a mysterious illness. Then just 6 months later, in 1884, their daughter Mary Olive also passed away from the same illness. Then, in 1889, the events that would set this saga in motion occurred when George's son, Edwin, a store clerk, started showing signs of this same disease. Now, the doctors were pretty clear. This was not some mysterious ailment. It was tuberculosis, or consumption. But this was New England in the 1800s. Cold logic didn't play as well as supernatural horror. Folks wanted a solution to their problems, not a doctor's cold promise of death. It probably didn't help either that following Edwin's sickness, more of the Brown family children began to pass away. For instance, in 1892, Mercy Lena Brown, only 19 years old, died on January 17th. At this point, George Brown had lost his wife and 2 daughters, and now his son was increasingly falling ill. The community wasn't having it, and they were done sitting around. They suspected that one of George's deceased relatives wasn't staying properly dead, and was instead sneaking out of the grave at night to feed on the living, specifically on Edwin. A Providence Journal article from March 19th of 1892 recounts what happened next. Despite George and the local doctors not believing in vampires, the townsfolk more or less bullied George into letting them exhume the body to find the culprit. And on March 17th of 1892, 1892, a group of local men went to Chestnut Hill Cemetery to investigate. First up, they exhumed Mary, the mother, and Mary Olive. Now, both of them had been buried for years and were well and good dead, decomposed as expected because, it had been 2 whole years. But then they turned to Mercy, which is another story. Unlike the others, Mercy hadn't been buried underground because it was winter in New England and the ground was frozen solid, and therefore her body had been kept in an above-ground crypt. Cold storage, essentially. Additionally, it had only been a couple of months since she passed, so not much time for her to decompose, and thus you can probably guess what happened next. When the townspeople opened up her coffin, well, let's just say Mercy looked a little too well preserved for their liking. Her face supposedly still had color, and also, here's the part where science cries softly into a pillow, they found liquid blood in her heart and veins, which is pretty normal when you've been left in cold temperatures and haven't actually been decomposing. Regardless, this was all the proof they needed. Mercy Brown was a confirmed vampire. So what did they do? Something very normal and not horrifying at all. They removed her heart, and maybe her lungs, and they burned them into ashes. And then it gets worse, so maybe skip forward like 30 seconds if you don't want to hear the nasty thing that happens. But they mixed the ashes with water to make a tonic. And then Edwin, the son with tuberculosis, they had him drink it. I'm sorry you had to hear this, and I regret writing this down. Unsurprisingly, Edwin died 2 months later, on May 2nd of 1892. Whether it was tuberculosis or the vampire smoothie, we'll never really know, but I have my suspicions. Tragically, 3 more of George Brown's daughters would pass away of tuberculosis. Only one, Hattie Mabel, would survive into the 20th century. So, to our modern sensibilities, this sounds like something out of a gothic horror novel. But to those people of Exeter, this was very real. When faced with the slow, relentless death march of tuberculosis and the helplessness that came with it, they turned to superstition and folklore for answers. And anyways, that's how a teenage girl named Mercy Brown became one of America's most famous vampires and maybe one of America's most famous smoothies. Still, let's all agree. Maybe we stick to chicken soup next time your brother's sick and leave the Organ Ash tonics in 1892 where they belong. Right now, I'm going to tell you about a place that is invisibly remarkable, a place called Chopmist Hill. This hill is located in the rural town of Scituate, Rhode Island, one of the state's higher points, though you wouldn't know that by looking at it. It's a hill in a very gentle sense, too, rising gradually up to its peak and covered today in some forest, fields, and a few scattered homes, as well as some industrial sites along country roads. It's ordinary countryside mostly, pleasant but easily overlooked. And that's exactly why it's jaw-dropping, that this quiet, dare I say forgettable hill became one of the most legendary listening posts in all of World War II. This story begins with a man named Thomas B. Cape in 1940, a Boston radio technician charged by the Intelligence Division of the Federal Communications Commission with finding a hilltop that could serve as a listening post to overhear radio signals for a pretty, trivial purpose. Some say this purpose was to intercept signals from potential German spies in the USA, and this might have been part of it, but from what I can tell, the primary purpose was basically rule enforcement. In other words, to intercept illegal private and commercial radio signals. Nothing world-shattering, really. At this point, Thomas Cape had been to a handful of hilltops, and he was finding he could get a broadcast from Vermont here, and maybe a weather forecast from Kansas there, but he wasn't finding anything particularly useful, rather about what they expected to have to grapple with. He figured what they found and set up would be a regional facility to intercept radio transmissions at best. That being said, when Thomas drove to the top of Chopmist Hill, then on one William Suttard's quaint farm, it would be putting it lightly to say what he found was groundbreaking. Now, to this day, the exact reason for this isn't clear. But essentially, because of geographic and atmospheric properties, at the top of Chopmist Hill, you could hear radio transmissions from about anywhere in the USA. Seriously, you could hear low-frequency signals that were meant to be transmitted just hundreds of miles at most, from thousands of miles away here, if not the world across. Suddenly, this place became far more interesting than a base of operations for intercepting illegal broadcasts. Cave, of course, reported this, and the military at first thought he was bogus, but they humored him and set up a test, broadcasting a signal from the Pentagon 353 miles away to see if he was bluffing. And sure enough, in less than 10 minutes, Thomas Cave provided the signal's origin to the military. Now, sadly, this remarkable quality would briefly displace the Sutter family, the farmers that lived here, and in their place, the military would erect telephone poles and tens of thousands of feet of antenna wire, wiring it straight into what used to be the Sutter farmhouse, making it a proper military installation too, with guards, fences, barracks, and all, and filling the home with a spy team to listen to radio broadcasts all over the USA for signs of German spies and illegal broadcasts, sending anything they intercepted and believed to be coded especially back to Washington. The crazy thing is, though, soon they realized that this position wasn't just capable of intercepting transmissions across the USA. They could literally hear German tank-to-tank radio transmissions in North Africa, listening in on the intimate conversations between their operators. They could hear weather forecasts in Central Europe. They had even been able to overhear Japanese messages in the Pacific sometimes, including some that seemed to hint at the looming attack at Pearl Harbor. And once America joined in the war, this station continued intercepting Japanese transmissions, in particular intercepting communications related to Japanese efforts to send explosive-packed hot air balloons over the U.S. Admittedly, most of these explosives were inert anyways, though. The station even played a part in rescue efforts, hearing distress signals that nobody else could, and guiding over 600 lost airplanes to a safe landing. Heck, this station even gets credit for saving the British ship, the Queen Mary, it's pretty famous, you might have heard of it, when it overheard orders from Germany to its submarines to sink the ship, and they led the Queen Mary to change its course. And I know I already used heck, but I'm all out of transitional expressions. But seriously, this place was wild, and they even discovered a secret German weather station in Greenland from Chopmist Hill. In short, this place was wildly effective. I even came across a statement by RID Chief George Sterling that literally worried about the staff at Chopmist Hill's safety because this place was so effective. He said, I quote, "If the enemy had known how we were recording messages sent between agents right in Germany, they would have eliminated the Scituate station and everyone on it, provided they could. It was that big of an advantage." Now, to be fair, this was in part because the signals used by the Germans for communication were difficult to detect in England, but easier to detect further away, like in North America. Ultimately, this place, along with the 11 other but not quite as effective listening posts, would change the trajectory of World War II and perhaps give us that slight edge that ultimately sealed the Allied victory. Chopmist Hill would ultimately be revealed to exist after the war's end, though the station was maintained until about 1950, fulfilling its original purpose of capturing unlicensed radio transmitters. Afterwards, it would be taken over by Rhode Island's Civil Preparedness Division as its headquarters, before in 1965 becoming private land once again. Today, because the area is more developed with homes, and in the region there are some factories and other buildings too, the area is sadly no longer valuable for intercepting radio transmissions like it once was. You sadly could no longer hear tank transmissions or German weather forecasts here, I guess, unless you leveled the whole region. Some today, including the man who discovered this location, Cave, claimed that maybe this wasn't such a bad thing either, as in his eyes, Chopmist Hill's success was more due to the expertise of the operators and their excellent equipment than the location itself. But I see this topic hotly debated on the sparse forums that discuss this hill's significance. Regardless, Chopmist Hill will forever be remembered as a place where, in short, you could listen to the whole world right here from atop a hill in Rhode Island. In modern-day Cumberland, Rhode Island, literally comprising the northeast portion of the state, there's a stone pillar with a metal plaque that refers to itself as Nine Men's Misery, positioned just in front of a stone cairn. This place is rich in historical lore and modern folklore, and could very well be the highlight of any Rhode Island Haunted Places video. But today, we're here to talk about why it bears this solemn name. The origin of this place's modern significance begins on March 26th of 1675, in the midst of King Philip's War. Just before this date, some Narragansett tribe members had recently burned down some Rhode Island settlements as part of the war effort, and they'd also attacked the Plymouth colony. But after their attack, and the subsequent battle, it appeared, at least to Captain Michael Pierce, like these natives were low on supplies, and like many of them were injured, and so Captain Pierce thought it was an excellent opportunity to follow these forces and put an end to them. And thus, with about 60 Plymouth Colony militia in tow and 20 allied Wampanoag warriors, Captain Pierce would pursue these injured forces to what is modern-day Central Falls, Rhode Island, capturing them in a deep river bend along the Blackstone River. The thing is, though, these native forces weren't injured. Rather, they were feigning being injured and low on supplies to lure Captain Pierce's forces deep into native territory, where they had the upper hand. And the colonists, they fell for it. Thus, while the colonial militia fought for hours, they were surrounded and outgunned, and as many of them fell, and only about a dozen of the militia remained, they tried to make a retreat, crossing the Blackstone River again and running along a trail through the swamps. That being said, these efforts were futile, and the surviving 10 men were ultimately captured at the site of the modern-day monastery and Cumberland Public Library. Everyone else had perished, and only a handful of Narragansett warriors were lost during the struggle. It was among the biggest colonial defeats of the entire King Philip's War. Of course, it wasn't over yet, though. Once captured, these 10 colonists were tortured, as some references I'm reading claim was customary of the Narragansett tribe, and then 9 of them were executed, though one man was able to escape. Initially, these men were left right where they were felled, but English colonists eventually went looking for them and buried them right here at this site, afterwards laying a large pile of stones to memorialize their fallen kin. This pile of stones was continuously kept at this site from 1676 onward, and to this day, a memorial remains right where these men were buried, thus becoming known over time as 9 Men's Misery, in remembrance of these fallen and tortured colonists. Now, to be clear, this site was disturbed a few times in its history. For instance, in 1790, medical students disturbed the site looking for the body of colonist Benjamin Buckland, who, folklore says, had a double row of teeth. Dang, I bet that guy could chew a walnut. But all disturbances stopped in 1928 when monks that ran the Cumberland Monastery, an order of Cistercian monks at the time, made a cemented stone cairn, the cairn that still calls this place home. As for the property today, as I said earlier, it's still referred to as the Cumberland Monastery and Library, and the old monastery building still stands today as home to Cumberland's Public Library. The grounds here appear peaceful and really don't elicit any memory of the horrible things that once took place here, but I'm sure if you're at this library late at night and you hear a strange noise, that peaceful atmosphere will evaporate pretty darn fast. As for the actual monument, it's sort of tucked away from the property in the woods, and I've even seen it mentioned that there are fallen trees frequently along the path that leads there, perhaps urging those that come this way to stay away if they're faint of heart. Of course, it's this seclusion, mixed with the atrocities that took place here, that lead many to think this place is haunted, and today, I've seen it mentioned as one of the more haunted places in the entire state. These hauntings, of course, include everything from ghostly wails of colonists to the sightings of Native American warriors riding translucent horses. But hey, I don't want to spoil the ghost stories too much. We'll save those for a more topical video. As for the significance of this place, well, it's not just any historical monument. It's the oldest war monument in the entire USA, a place that is still shepherded to this day because of that accolade. Also, we're not done here. I bet you anything this location will be revisited soon in a Haunted Places video in the near future. So let me know down below if you want to see one of those for New England, or maybe even just for Rhode Island. In Newport, Rhode Island, a place most know for its luxurious mansions and famed cliff walk, which, yeah, I've sadly been a shill and done that walk and paid way too much money to tour a Vanderbilt mansion, there's a round stone structure that stands in modern-day Turo Park at the top of Mill Street and in a historical neighborhood that's, at least to some, slightly mysterious. This structure consists of over 450 tons of stone, and the thing is called the Old Stone Mill. The tower admittedly looks a bit larger than life, and it's more elaborate than most early New England structures, at least the ones I've come across, which probably helps its acclaim. Seriously, it's gigantic. It has a 22 to 23 foot diameter, depending on where you measure it, but a mystery stems from the fact that there's really no record of anyone building it. All we really know about it is that as far back as the early 1800s, folks treated this structure, which most think is the base of an old windmill, as mysterious. And in the 1830s, we know the tower was credited to individuals visiting this place pre-Columbus. Seriously though, in the 1800s, people were really into this tower. I saw a quote from the man who runs the Newport Tower Museum, that's across the street from this tower, yes, it has a museum, that claimed at one point in the 1800s it may have been the biggest tourist destination in the entire state of Rhode Island. People bought souvenirs, beer steins, mugs, spoons, plates, and etc. with imagery of this tower on it, calling it the Old Stone Mill, but really believing it served a different purpose. By 1900, folks started calling it the, I quote, ancient Viking tower instead. And in 1925, Newport, Rhode Island even opened a hotel referring to it as the Hotel Viking, a name it earned from a public vote. So, in short, there was a strong belief that this tower is truly pre-Columbian. For instance, in 1837, Carl Christian Raff, in a book, proposed that Dyden Rock, the strangely inscribed rock we talked about 2 weeks ago, alongside this tower, may have been proof that the Norse were here, and this tower was just another one of those things they left behind, and that it was an 11th to 14th century church left behind that would have been, I quote, architecturally obsolete by the 17th century. You also get a bit of that Dyden Rock treatment here, with others claiming everyone from the Knights Templar that explored Westboro with Henry Sinclair, I guess I should say supposedly, to the Chinese built this tower, which, okay, whatever you say, dude, I don't think this was the Chinese. Regardless, is it true? Is this stone structure truly the work of the Vikings or somebody else from very long ago? Well, to start, let me put it out there that we know with certainty the Vikings were in North America. That is a fact. As for this tower, well, nothing at all in early Norse architecture is similar to this tower in size or appearance. That being said, the construction of the tower has quite a bit in common with English windmills from the 1600s. Additionally, we may have an idea of who this windmill belonged to, at least at one point. See, this tower rests on the upper end of a plot of land behind a now demolished mansion that belonged at one point to Benedict Arnold, the first colonial governor of Rhode Island, who actually moved to Newport in 1651. In 1677, in his will, he would refer to, I quote, my stone-built windmill, when referring to where he wanted to be buried, and this statement is taken as credence that 400 years ago, this site might have been an operational windmill. Furthermore, in 1848, some mortar samples were collected alongside others from the region, and they were found to all be composed of shell lime, sand, and gravel, suggesting this mill and nearby structures were built from the same materials. Further, in 1948, the site was partially excavated, and they didn't find Viking artifacts. Rather, everything they found was consistent with a 17th century construction. Finally, in 1993, the mortar was radiocarbon dated, with results suggesting that the mortar was produced somewhere between 1635 and 1698. In short, when this area was already very much settled by English people. So, personally, given all of the solid evidence leaning towards this tower being fairly modern, I rest on this being an English creation rather than one by the Vikings, and definitely not the Chinese or Scottish Knights, sorry. Regardless, this is a place of great meaning to the Newport locals, and they clearly take great care of their tower. Heck, its imagery is even on the seal and unit patch of the former U.S. Navy vessel, the USS Newport. It goes without saying, I've had a couple of kicks recently. To start, in my last Massachusetts video, I was on a bit of a rock kick, covering everything from a stone with a knight carved into it to a pile of rocks built to spite people. But now I'm starting to wonder if I'm on a multi-video spite kick, because Well, as I said in the Massachusetts video, I covered a spite-fueled rock pile that I found to be properly entertaining. But here in Rhode Island, I think I found a feature that'll one-up it. A spite tower, built to similarly tell a neighbor to shove it and block their view. This is the story of this tower, built with hate in mind, at least according to legend. Now, quick caveat, there's not much we know for certain about this story, if there's any truth to it at all, but we do know this story begins with a few brothers named the Church Brothers, Samuel, Ebenezer, and Nathaniel, who moved to Adamsville, Rhode Island in the late 1700s, and while they were there they opened a store and a salt works, or a plant where salt was prepared commercially. Of course, these brothers while living here would acquire some property. This was the 1700s after all, and the real estate market was a bit more favorable than it is today in New England, and eventually this land would come to be owned by who I presume was a relative to Samuel Ebenezer, a man named Thaddeus Church. Then, in 1905, he'd give this land and home to his great-niece Claudia and her husband, Dr. Hathaway. The legend also goes that in town there was a man named Abraham Manchester, a store owner whose store was nearby and who also lived nearby. His store and home were so close, in fact, that the legend says he could see from his store window into his home's window, where Manchester's sister would signal it was lunch and dinner time by hanging a white dish towel in the window. Manchester, at least for a while, was also really good friends with Dr. Hathaway. Perhaps it was happenstance because they were neighbors, but the legend says these two were the best of friends. That being said, the story says that changed. Now, depending on who's telling it, it varies a bit, but it always involves Manchester and Dr. Hathaway having a falling out. Some say it was due to a dispute over an inheritance. Others say it was some sort of love triangle. Whatever it was, though, a tower would come up on the property of Dr. Hathaway. A tower, they said, that was positioned just perfectly to block Mr. Manchester's view of his home's window. And thus, he'd never be able to see the signal that it was lunchtime ever again. This is the legend and the cause of the tower's dreadful name as the Spite Tower. So with this story in mind, is it true? Was this tower truly built with hate in mind? Well, as you know, I'm Captain Buzzkill, and I have an explanation for you. To start, maybe there was some hatred involved in this tower's construction, but as for what we can verify, we can say for certain this tower was, well, simply a water tower, harking back to the days when homes used gravity-fed plumbing systems. In short, you had to get water up the tower for it to fall back into the home. It was likely not in any way related to a dispute. So who knows, maybe some people did get in a tizzy over it being built, but it was probably just a luxury item for the house. As for today though, the tower is rented out by a local business, and it's also an Airbnb. And personally, I find that Airbnb thing a plenty good reason to hate this tower. But as for having any historical hatred tied to it, probably not. If you've been around here for a while, you'll know that early on in the Weird Folklore series, I had a thing with monkeys going on. In Ohio, there was a lost but never recovered monkey in Minerva Park. Then in Boston, we talked about how construction workers found a mummified mummy while demolishing the old TD garden that borderline came up with its own curse of the monkey. But for months now, I've been silent on monkeys. That is, until I came across an old story of a monkey named Jocko. No, not that Jocko, darn it, this Jocko. That's right. See, back in 1928, there was a saga at the Roger Williams Park Zoo, where a little monkey, a sooty mangabe, I hope I'm saying that right, decided, you know what, I can do better than this, and started dreaming of freedom, and left his little monkey island behind. As for how he escaped, the full drama isn't really mentioned, but I could find it happened while his keepers were cleaning the island's moats. Yes, they lived on an island. They must have placed something around that gave Jocko this opportunity. He escaped for a period of about 2 weeks, and during these 2 weeks, my impression is that little Jocko was as much a menace as he was a novelty. For instance, on September 1st, he was noted to have given chase to one Miss Stuart McKay around modern 144 Althea Street, chasing her inside and presumably wanting the food she was carrying. He also surprised police officers, and children were noted to have went and gotten bananas for him, which they'd hold in the air for him to swing by, grab, and eat. As with all monkey stories, the children were of course his little allies, and I adore this detail. Also, firefighters would occasionally sight him and climb up into a tree with their ladders, but he would always swing away with ease. Of course, as we should know well, us and our ancestors aren't so different from trash pandas, and Jocko would, on September 3rd, be seen rummaging in a garbage can on Ridge Street when the zoo superintendent, Jeremiah Triggs, would be called. But it wouldn't be any official figure affiliated with zoo or law enforcement officers that ended up catching him. It was a man named John Gormley of 53 Carpin Street. A man remembered in the annals of history for only this action, who actually, just without food or anything, was noted to, I quote, with some weird power, coax him down into a backyard on Amherst Street, after which he would grab the monkey, who fought him a bit, but was ultimately cornered, with Jocko being bound within 10 minutes by firefighters. They say that upon his capture, there was a cheering crowd, though whether they were cheering for law enforcement or the monkey, it isn't exactly clear. Now, funny as it is, Jocko actually briefly escaped the wooden cage he was placed in after being caught the first time, but again, John Gormley captured him quickly this time and put him back in. They then, I kid you not, put him in a taxi and taxied the monkey back to the zoo, where he was put back on Monkey Island. His fellow monkeys were apparently very unhappy with his return, and here's the one photo we have of Jocko. Here he is, head halfway underwater as he stared at the island, pissed to be back and pissed that his friends didn't want him there. Today, in honor of Roger Williams Park's 150th anniversary, you can actually see an art piece called Monkey Island that actually represents the monkeys that used to be here, and tells the story of Jocko's escape and his 2 weeks of freedom. There are 10 monkey sculptures on the island, and fittingly, Jocko isn't with them. His sculpture is on the shore, representing that he was the little critter that decided to take a leap that no monkey on Monkey Island had ever done before, and that his soul resides on the mainland, not as a captive animal in the zoo. On May 15th of 1900, something interesting supposedly happened in a neighborhood of Providence named Olneyville. Olneyville, for reference, is in modern day a neighborhood just about a mile and a half west of Providence's urban core. But back then, it was a working-class part of town filled with industry, textile mills and such, and it was known for its wool mills. This day, I can only imagine, was a tough day to work in these mills. Records of the incident say that around noon it was 93 degrees, paired with an industrial building filled with machines and people and no air conditioning. I'd bet you'd have a recipe for temperatures well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That being said, there would be a reprieve. They say that near the end of the workday, at about 4 p.m., the sky would turn to black, and the factory workers would watch their thermometers rapidly indicate that the air was cooling as air from the sea was rapidly transported inland. And then lightning began to flash and thunder boomed, with a storm and heavy rain pouring down upon Olneyville, and presumably the rest of Providence. But the reason this day is notable isn't because it just rained a lot. It's that it rained fish. Records say specifically pout and perch, and that they were dropped in the highest quantity near the Grove Street Railroad crossing on Harris Avenue and on Jocelyn Street. The records say that these fish were all over the street. They hit the ground hard and began to flop about. Children, of course, had a blast with this, and they ran around the streets collecting these aquatic visitors. And some kids apparently even tried to peddle them to locals as a novelty, a, I quote, fish that fell from the sky. Some families even collected them, throwing them into glass containers in their homes and keeping them on display. Heck, there's even a record of a saloon named the Corcoran and O'Gara Saloon that would put one of these fish in a tank of water on display, and that many folks that came into the bar to drink that evening would, I quote, watch the sky fish in amazement. It's said that for days following this, stray but dead fish would be found on the street here and there. Of course, in the subsequent days, this story would echo through the newsprints, and a policeman would even come forward in the Providence Daily Journal and vouch for this strange saga, claiming that he himself grabbed a pout off the street. As for what caused this strange saga, of course there was a bit of speculation that something of biblical proportions had occurred, but in reality it was probably just a waterspout that lifted fish from the sea and cast them the short distance to land this day. As far as I can tell though, this is the only time on record that fish have been observed raining from the sky in Rhode Island, but I betcha it won't be the last. If you ever find yourself driving through Smithfield, Rhode Island, and happen to take a turn into the intersection of Manschool Road and Colwell Road, you might notice something odd. It's a tiny little traffic barrier that looks like it's just waiting to be pinched and told, who's a good little traffic obstacle? But then you spot the real culprit, a tree. And not just any tree, one that's smack in the middle of an intersection. Now, obviously, this little barrier is here to keep the tree safe, or to keep you safe from the tree, and let's be honest, to protect your car from meeting its untimely end by way of a wooden trunk. But if you think this tree is just a random road hazard they decided to preserve, think again. If we rewind to 2011, you'd see this intersection didn't have a tiny, almost too cute barrier. Instead, there was an old, gnarly tree with a thick trunk and chunks of bark missing, clear signs of being battered by countless cars over the years. There's also no shortage of accident reports about cars speeding, ignoring stop signs, and running right into this tree, some of them even ending tragically in fatalities. Naturally, this tree became notorious, and when something's notorious, people get creative. Here enters a legend about a witch. Now, the most popular version of this story claims that if you drive around this tree backwards 3 times and continue down the road, you'll summon a witch from the woods. And she doesn't just appear, mind you, she'll chase you down, often, sometimes at least, riding a wooden broomstick. Other stories say that her ghostly apparition appears, since allegedly her body was buried beneath this very tree, and the vibrations of traffic stirred her restless soul. To be clear, don't you dare drive backwards in the middle of an intersection. It's very illegal and very dangerous, and T-Storytime will think it's very uncool if you do this. There's also a version of this story that claims the tree was planted by the witch herself. Legend says when they were paving the road, she cursed the town, demanding they spare her tree. And so they did, and the witch was said to live in a nearby house and keep watch over her leafy prize. The solution to summon her in this version was actually just to throw a stick at the abandoned house. Yet another thing you absolutely should not do if you see a house nearby. And also to be clear, this old house belonged to an old man. It wasn't a witch. And he told the local newsprint many times that he was very unhappy about rocks being thrown at his home. Also, of course, there's a ghostly version of this tale, that at night, the witch can be seen pacing in circles around her tree, which, let's face it, is a lot more ominous than your average street lamp. But hey, we'll cover this ghostly version a little more later. So yeah, you get the idea. A combination of accidents, bad luck, and local superstition led to the belief that this tree was cursed. Though, in all fairness, it was a pretty dangerous thing to have in the middle of an intersection. But time, as it always does, took its toll. The old tree became diseased and was battered by many cars, and eventually it had to be removed. But then, in 2012, just a little bit after removing it from what I can tell, a new tree was planted where the old one stood, and a new barrier was put up to prevent any more close calls with cars. But the legend, despite the tree being new, that lives on. In the end, this whole story is probably just a creative way of explaining a weird tree in the middle of the road and the accidents that followed it. But hey, who can blame the locals for turning an oddity into a full-blown witch tale? It adds some flavor to what is otherwise an ordinary intersection. Rhode Island. For a little state, you've got a ton of folklore. I think some residents from larger states are going to be borderline offended that you got as much content as they did. Hey, between us though, I had a great time here. Anyways, as always, if you had a good time with this one, let me know in the comments, and please, 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 sub and like the video if you want to keep this channel chugging along. Also, you see that little thumbs up button below the video? If you clicked that would be swell. Otherwise, as for what's next, as it turns out, Rhode Island has some of the craziest cryptids in America, including one that inspired a famous slasher film, so stay tuned for that. And we're going to take another quick detour to give a certain state a part 2. Oh, also, while we're at it, we're getting geared up for October's Spooktacular, so make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss a month of scary history and haunted tales. Anyways, with that, thank you for watching, and with all this in mind, whether a cod just fell from the sky straight into your deep fryer, or if your mom caught a cold and your dads started talking about digging up your old relatives and giving them autopsies, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.